Paul Castellano was the head of the Gambino crime family. When Carlo Gambino passed away in 1976, Paul became his successor. Carlo believed that Paul Castellano was the ideal choice to be his successor because of his focus and dedication to white-collar business. Paul had the business sense and the street smarts to run the Gambino crime family. What made him different from other crime bosses was his commitment to the business side of things. In his mind, he wasn't a criminal. He was a businessman who specialized in taking over businesses that weren't legit and turning them into legitimate and profitable companies. He created an enterprise, but along with that came controversies and enemies. Ultimately, Paul Castellano's reign over New York City's crime came to an end in 1985 after he was assassinated by his #1 rival, John Gotti. This hit marked a huge turning point in the history of New York's crime. The fall of one leader became the rise of one of the world's most notorious gangsters. Paul Castellano was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1915. His father, Giuseppe Castellano, was a member of the Mangano crime family. This crime family was the forerunner to the Gambino crime family. Giuseppe was also a butcher, and Paul followed in his footsteps at an early age with meat cutting and crime. Paul was convicted of his first offense at the age of 19 after robbing a haberdasher. He spent 3 months in prison but earned huge loyalty points with the Mafia. At the time of the robbery, Paul was working with 2 other men, but he refused to speak on their names during trial and when he was in prison. This showed that he was a loyal member and the family could trust him. Paul also had close ties to the Gambino family. His sister Catherine had married Carlo Gambino in 1932. At this point in time, Carlo was only a cousin of the crime family. It wasn't until 1957 that he became the boss. In the 1940s, Paul officially became part of the Mangano crime family. He started as a Mafia cousin and eventually rose through the ranks to the position of capo regime. Loyalty was one of the main reasons that Paul was able to climb the Mafia ranks. In 1957, an Appalachian meeting for Mafia members was held in Appalachian, New York. There were over 60 Mafia members at this summit. Every member showed up dressed lavishly and driving a luxurious vehicle. All of the expensive cars in the area were what ultimately caught the police's attention. The meeting was raided before it even began. Paul and 60 other Mafia members were arrested. Paul Castellano's ability to remain silent is what helped him further his position with the crime family when he was only 19. After the raid, he refused to speak again and spent a year in prison. In 1976, Carlo Gambino passed away from natural causes. Everyone expected him to choose Agnello Della Roche as his successor because he worked as Carlo's underboss, but that wasn't what happened at all. Instead, Carlo chose Paul Castellano to be his successor. Paul had a white-collar business sense that Carlo hadn't noticed in any other family member. He knew that Paul's leadership was exactly what the Gambino crime family needed. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the drug trade was the most profitable business for Mafia families, but the Gambino family did things differently. Carlo Gambino set a rule when he was in charge that prevented family members from dealing and trafficking drugs. Anyone who was connected to the Gambino crime family and participated in the drug trade wouldn't become a made man. On top of that, any members that were caught trafficking would be killed. One of the other reasons Carlo trusted Paul was that he knew this rule would stay intact. Paul's business-oriented approach is what made him stand out from the rest. He didn't rule with violence and fear. Instead, he prided himself on his ability to make a profit, and that's exactly why the Gambino family trusted him. But he would use his ties to the Mafia to intimidate people when it came to his business dealings when he needed to, and if anyone got in his way or wronged him, he would have them killed. The first business venture was Dial Poultry, a startup company that supplied poultry to over 300 butchers in New York. Of course, the meat industry wasn't Paul's only business venture. His son Philip was the president of a concrete company, Scaramix Concrete. This company had a monopoly on concrete in Staten Island. The Gambino crime family ended up managing concrete interests through the Concrete Club. They would select specific contractors through the mob to manage contracts that were worth millions of dollars. They also had control of the Teamsters Union Local Chapter 282, which gave them access to all major concrete pouring jobs through New York and Long Island. The money was in the Gambino family's hands, exactly how Paul Castellano had planned it. A Mafia boss doesn't make it to the top without making a few enemies along the way. Carlo Gambino had a vision when he appointed Paul Castellano as his successor, but not everyone in the Gambino crime family agreed with his decision. Many believed that Carlo's underboss, Agnello Della Roche, should have gotten the title. This caused the crime family to split into 2 parts, Agnello's people in Brooklyn and Paul's people in Manhattan. Despite how he felt about the situation, Agnello respected Carlo's decision and stayed loyal to his role and Paul. When it came to criminal activity, Paul wanted to remain off the radar. He had already had complications with the police in the past and didn't need to draw any attention to himself. This led to him becoming reclusive. He stayed quiet and rarely, if ever, came in contact with the men who were doing his dirty work. Paul was soon dubbed the Howard Hughes of mob bosses because it was rare to see him. He would only speak with certain top-tier members. Other members of the Mafia weren't allowed to interact with him. If they had money to deliver to him, they would have to leave it in an envelope outside his door. The Mafia members that were allowed to speak with him didn't have it any easier than the other guys. Paul Castellano was known to be very out of touch and was quick to insult and berate other members. It wasn't just his arrogant attitude that made insiders hate him. The man was making millions from these business deals. He was living in a lap of luxury. He lived in a huge mansion in Staten Island, had many expensive cars, and even traveled in a private helicopter. Yet, it wasn't enough. Paul wanted more and more money, and he was getting greedy about it. When Paul started business with the Mafia, his men did the work and he kept 10% of the profits. Over time, he began to take more money from these men. He started by increasing his share to 15% and got greedier and greedier. Paul also ran a tight ship when it came to the no drugs allowed rule. Members of the Gambino family didn't have to be involved in the drug trade to be on the receiving end of Paul's wrath. Even if they were caught doing drugs recreationally, he would make sure they were punished. Nicholas Gambetta was an associate of the Gambino family, but he liked to party and was known to be reckless. After publicly doing cocaine and insulting another Gambino member's daughter, Paul ordered a hit on him. This was a lesson to other Gambino family members to stay away from the drug scene. There were very few people that Paul could trust. For this reason, he made a deal with an Irish-American gang called the Westies. He wanted to hire hitmen that weren't directly tied to the Gambino family. This would keep law authorities off his trail. Throughout all his dealings, there was one Mafia member in particular who really had it out for Paul Castellano. John Gotti was a protege of Agnello Della Roche and was a mid-level capo from the Gambino family. He disagreed with the way Paul ran business. He thought that the mob boss's reclusiveness and greed made him a poor leader. On top of that, John Gotti was also dipping his hands in the heroin trafficking trade, something he knew Paul Castellano wouldn't stand for if he found out. To make things worse, in 1983, two members of the Gambino Mafia family, John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero, were arrested for dealing heroin. An arrest was made due to evidence on recording in Angelo Ruggiero's house, but since the men involved refused to hand over the tapes to Paul, he was enraged. This furthered the rift between him and John Gotti, but it also meant more trouble for Paul Castellano. After the trial regarding the tapes, the judge allowed for Paul's house to be bugged. This led to authorities getting over 600 hours of evidence that connected Gambino and other mafias to racketeering crimes. He was arrested but released the next day on a $2 million bail. A few months later, his name was mentioned in connection to a car theft ring. Paul knew he needed to lay low again to avoid authorities again. Legal problems weren't the only thing Paul Castellano had to worry about. John Gotti was a wild card. The only reason he followed in line with Paul's orders was because of his respect for Agnello. The underboss was in good standing with John Gotti, but all of this changed on December 2, 1985, when Agnello passed away. Paul did three things that infuriated John Gotti after Agnello passed. The first thing he did was appoint Thomas Bilotti as his new underboss. In John Gotti's mind, this man didn't have the skills or the experience to be a reputable underboss. The second thing that Paul Castellano did to upset John Gotti was refuse to attend Agnello's funeral. Allegedly, Paul didn't attend this funeral because he believed that it was monitored by law enforcement, something he was trying to avoid at all cost. But John Gotti didn't see it this way. He viewed Paul's lack of attendance as the ultimate sign of disrespect to Agnello. The third thing Paul Castellano planned to do was break up John Gotti's crew. After all, he wanted all drug-related activity as far from his Mafia family as possible. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bilotti were assassinated outside of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. John Gotti arranged this hit to take place. He had a team of gunmen ready to take down the elusive Mafia boss. 3 men were ready nearby the restaurant, and another 3 were waiting down the street in case they were needed for backup. John Gotti didn't have to look far to find men who would support him in carrying out this hit. He was able to seek support from other crime families that weren't in good standing with Paul Castellano. This included members from the Bonanno, Lucchesi, and Colombo families. Once he had the support he needed, he picked out his hitmen and arranged the attack. It was approximately 5:26 p.m. when Thomas Bilotti parked the car and Paul Castellano exited the passenger door. He was met by gunmen immediately and shot 6 times. His underboss was shot 4 times when he exited the car. While all of this was happening, John Gotti was sitting in a car with his co-conspirator, Salvatore Sammy Gravano. Sammy was one of John Gotti's most trusted men. He was also the brother-in-law of Nicholas Gambetta, who Paul Castellano put a hit on. John Gotti and Sammy watched the assassination take place. John was giving orders to the hitmen over walkie-talkies. Before they left the scene of the crime, John Gotti drove over to see the bodies for himself. 1 month after the murder of Paul Castellano and his successor, John Gotti was named the new boss of the Gambino family. Before Paul Castellano's death, the Pizza Connection trial began. This trial focused on independent pizza restaurants that were used to distribute drugs. In the mid-1970s and early 1980s, $1.65 billion worth of heroin was imported from Southwest Asia to the U.S. This led to an extensive investigation into the Mafia's connection with the drug trade. Throughout the investigation, authorities uncovered a massive drug smuggling and money laundering operation. Many Sicilian and American Mafia families became targets of law enforcement. All of this occurred while Paul was in charge of the Gambino crime family. Although his Mafia didn't participate in the drug trade, he still had reason to be worried because of his position. Ultimately, the Bonanno family were the main targets of the Pizza Connection trial. However, it was the start of many legal troubles that the Gambino family and other Mafia families would face in the 1980s. During his run, Paul Castellano was the boss of one of 5 Mafia families in New York's La Cosa Nostra. Paul was known as the boss of bosses during this time. He had a strict way of running his business. Loyalty and discipline were his core values. One thing about Paul Castellano is that he was never messy when it came to his rulings. While people may not have liked Paul on a personal note, they respected how he managed business. He was very conservative and never drew attention to himself when he was out in public. The less other people knew of him, the better, and he always obeyed the Mafia hierarchical structure. But his death changed history for the Gambino family and the Mafia in New York in general. With John Gotti in charge, things were a lot different. He was an aggressive and ruthless mob boss. The man had a reputation for becoming extremely violent, but was also able to avoid conviction. John Gotti also involved more people in his business trades, linking the Gambino family to other crime families. Paul Castellano ruled the Mafia with his business sense, while John Gotti ruled with fear and power. Paul Castellano had a certain mystique to him. Other Mafia bosses of his era were known to flaunt their wealth and prided themselves on being feared. It was different with Paul because of his reclusive personality. People in New York rarely saw him around, and he avoided the media at all cost. Yet, Paul's lavish lifestyle did keep people interested. When Paul was at the peak of his financial gain, he had a 17-room mansion custom-built in Tote Hill on Staten Island. This house is famous because it was built to resemble the White House. It even had an English garden and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. His style wasn't like other mobsters at the time either. Sure, he dressed proper when he was seen out in public, but for the most part, his daily wear consisted of silk and satin dressing gowns with velvet slippers. Paul Castellano makes Mafia history books for his impact on the world of organized crime. He was a complex leader who identified as a businessman, not as a leader of crime. He ruled with his discipline and always demanded loyalty from his Mafia family. When business wasn't going his way, he wasn't afraid to use Mafia intimidation tactics to get what he wanted. But ultimately, his leadership style led to his assassination in 1985. We have more inside stories from the Mafia to share with you. Check out our next video, The Most Ruthless Mafia Hitmen in History. Want to see more videos like this? Make sure you hit like and subscribe.